Well, let me echo Shaun's opening words of thanks to Diana, to Dean Hempton, to all of you for being here this evening. When I take a look at the terms religion and peacemaking, of course, I come at it from a somewhat different perspective. And I will not apologize for having been somewhat poisoned in my earlier days watching religious leaders in places like Bosnia who used their authority in ways that helped 250,000 people lose their lives. But I do believe, increasingly so, in the ability of religious leaders to play a positive role in particular stages of the conflict spectrum, but in particular in efforts to try to prevent and mitigate, and in the aftermath of conflict, reconcile. So let me take my 10 minutes this evening and separate out a couple of different areas that I want to cover. One is a couple of conceptual notes that I want you all to understand coming at this topic as I do from a secular multilateralist perspective. Second, let me tell you a little bit about what the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations is trying to do about it. And then third, let me give you some sense of the one place where I know Harvard can already play an important role in trying to bring these fields together. First, on the conceptual side, when we speak of religion in the context of conflict, we sometimes avoid talking about, for lack of a better term, the elephant in the room. Religion in and of itself is not really the issue in the context of conflicts that we described as religious. Identity is the issue that drives people to kill each other. Religion, in the conflicts that we talk about most frequently, represents the means by which a society chooses to divide itself into groups that then find themselves capable of killing one another. For example, you look at a place like the former Yugoslavia, and in the former Yugoslavia, for the better part of 2 generations, people weren't killing each other, they were intermarrying. And then, because particular political leaders decided that in an effort to try and bolster nationalist agendas, they would try to bring in religious leaders to try and assist in that process, you now had an additional force that helped to isolate groups, create identity, and create the opportunity for people to kill each other. Within that context, it's important to understand the concept of the other. We hear it used, we've even heard it used this evening. I think Diana started with that phrase. What does it really mean? It speaks to the issue of the psychology of warfare. And in particular in civil conflicts where you're fighting your neighbor, what creates the space necessary for you to pull the trigger on someone who lived down the street from you, whose children played with your children? It is the ability to see that person not as another person, but as an other, someone who does not share your identity and therefore does not deserve the kind of consideration you would give to your neighbor down the street. Well, what do we mean when we talk about teaching religion in that context? Well, Shaun and Jocelyne and I were all at a couple of conferences in Vienna a couple of weeks ago where one of the attempts to try to taxonomize this issue distinguished the difference between learning religion, which had to do with learning the ritual and the liturgy and the various things that distinguish one religion from another, from the concept of learning about and from religion, which was the interaction that religions have on a sociological and even a political orientation. And I would suggest to you that this is one of those areas where academic study would be particularly useful in distinguishing between these forms of learning as it relates to the concept of religion. The second thread of continuity that I would suggest here, and these are all related in one way or another, is the concept of religion as culture, which also feeds into the identity issue. When you learn religion, distinguishable from learning about or from religion, what are you actually learning? You're learning those things that clergymen are supposed to teach you about what it is you must do in order to pursue a particular path to God. Whether it has to do with the way in which you interact with other people, the distinctions between the way in which men and women deal with one another, dietary laws, the hymns one sings, all of that is part of this cultural milieu. It creates order, it creates structure, it creates purpose, and it helps to solidify the sense of identity. And I would suggest to you that that leads to the last element, which is religion as a form of humanism. Because when you are learning about religion, the more you learn, the more you realize that the Abrahamic faiths and the Eastern faiths as well have many shared values. And we hear about this from time to time, but only when people choose to try to create that identity issue do you see the distinctions. Religion as an inclusive element, the shared values of compassion, forgiveness, love, the golden rule, which applies in virtually every faith that we've ever learned about. All to say that as a form of humanism, there is a conscious choice that religious leaders can make as to which of the elements they choose to emphasize in their teaching. And we see this increasingly. Even today, it's not that the former Yugoslavia is old news. Look at Myanmar today, where one religious leader's skewed view of Buddhism leads to the identification of Muslims as an other and leads to hundreds of thousands being displaced from their own community. And so I would suggest to you that these are the conceptual frames in which we have to operate. Now, what is my job now, having returned to the UN after an absence of some time? The Alliance of Civilizations is an initiative of the Secretary General to serve as a soft power tool of diplomacy. And one of the things that we are compelled to do is to work on issues of religious difference, to work on issues where, by pursuing efforts to combat intolerance and polarization, that we actually find paths that use intercultural and interreligious dialogue. I will tell you this, that within the UN system, while there's a clear mandate for one's office to handle the high-level state-to-state political discussions, in the vast offices that represent the UN system, no one owns the issue of interreligious and intercultural dialogue. And so a lot of us are looking at this with an increasingly interested view of creating systems and possibly doctrine as to what the best ways are to use interreligious and intercultural dialogue as a bridging element in our policy work. I would suggest to you also that as we take a look at this concept of interreligious and interfaith dialogue, those of you who are going to be going out into the field, especially you HDS students who are here, you need to remember what it is out in the field that creates the reason why someone would want to have that dialogue with you. What are the underlying assumptions that we carry with us when we talk about the issue of interfaith and interreligious dialogue? It is at its core the notion that religious leaders and religious people have a certain credibility within their communities. What's that based on? It's got to be based on a shared understanding of the moral values that those people carry, their connections into the local community, and their ability to translate those values and that understanding into a voice that speaks to everyone within that community. I would suggest to you that that represents the most important thing that religious leaders and active religious participants can do in a peacemaking role. And now, finally, as a form of concluding, what does Harvard have to do in this game? Well, again, I'm a prisoner of my background, and so I will tell you that in the years, both with the UN and with the Carter Center, and now back with the UN again, the first people we talk to at Harvard are at the Program on Negotiation. It is a globally understood leader in the field of not only practice, but also the development of doctrine on everything from inter-party negotiations on a bilateral level to multilateral mediation efforts. And I would suggest to you that for those of you who are interested in pursuing dialogue processes, this is the place where the synergy that exists at Harvard needs to be applied the most. Because those of you who are developing religious backgrounds can also develop the ability to use those backgrounds in negotiation and mediation efforts. Thank you.